It was the kind of neighborhood that seemed perfect at first glance: quiet streets lined with well-maintained houses, families walking their dogs in the morning sun, and the occasional neighborhood barbecue. The lawns were lush, and the fences all seemed to follow a specific pattern, each property defined by tasteful hedges or neatly placed wooden enclosures. The kind of place where everyone knew your name, and your neighbors could practically tell if you'd been out of town by the state of your garden. For Mark, a recent transplant to the area, the move couldn't have come soon enough. After years of living in cramped apartments, he finally had the chance to buy his dream home, a spacious corner lot with plenty of room for his growing family. The house was perfect, but there was just one thing missing: privacy. Mark had always been a man who valued his personal space. After working long hours in his role as a county inspector, dealing with construction projects and zoning issues, he knew just how important it was to carve out time to unwind. And for him, that meant a backyard oasis, a peaceful sanctuary where he could sit back, relax, and let the world fade away. The house was nearly perfect, but the view from his backyard was not. His neighbors, though friendly, had children who ran around, constantly peeking into his backyard. The house next door, though charming, had a direct line of sight into Mark's living room and backyard from their upstairs windows. He didn't mind a friendly wave here and there, but he knew he needed some privacy. One afternoon, after months of debating, Mark decided it was time to act. He picked up the phone and called a reputable fencing company to install a 6-foot wooden privacy fence around his property. It was an investment, but one that he felt was necessary. He made sure to research all local regulations. He knew the rules about fence height, placement, and the necessary permits. As someone who worked for the county, he wasn't about to make any rash decisions without following the proper channels. Everything was in place. The fence went up quickly, and for the first time in weeks, Mark sat on his back porch, enjoying the privacy and seclusion the new fence provided. Little did he know, his peaceful days in his new home were about to be interrupted in a way he never expected. The HOA was watching. It didn't take long for Mark to hear from the Homeowners Association. Less than a week after his new fence was completed, a letter arrived in his mailbox, stamped with the bold, familiar letters, HOA Compliance Notice. Mark's stomach sank as he opened the envelope, expecting something mundane, like a reminder about lawn care or the need to trim his hedges. But as he read through the letter, it quickly became clear that his new fence was not going to fly with the HOA. The notice informed him that his fence violated the community's aesthetic standards. According to the HOA, it exceeded the maximum height limit set for fences in the neighborhood. They demanded that he remove the fence within 30 days or face a hefty fine. The letter cited specific rules about fence height and uniformity that Mark had never noticed when he moved in. Mark was immediately frustrated. He had made sure to follow the rules when installing the fence, and now he was being told it had to come down. He picked up the phone and dialed the HOA's contact number, eager to resolve the situation. The phone rang several times before a woman's voice picked up. "Hello, this is Sheila with the HOA. How can I assist you today?" she said in a somewhat cold tone. Mark introduced himself, explaining that he had received the notice about his fence and asking for clarification. "I'm sorry, sir," Sheila replied curtly, "but our guidelines are very clear. The fence must be lowered, or it will be considered a violation of the neighborhood's uniformity standards. We've had complaints from neighbors about the height." Mark was shocked. Complaints? Who had complained, and why? He didn't want to cause any trouble, but the idea of taking down the fence he had just installed didn't sit well with him. The HOA's inflexibility was maddening. "Could you please give me more details?" Mark asked, his frustration creeping into his voice. Sheila didn't offer any more information, just repeating the same line. "It's in the guidelines. I'd suggest you review the rules and address the situation accordingly." The call ended with the same vague, unhelpful response, leaving Mark stewing with anger and confusion. Who could have possibly complained about his fence? And why was the HOA so intent on forcing him to take it down? It didn't make sense. What did the HOA know about his fence that he didn't? Mark had to get to the bottom of it. But first, he needed to figure out exactly what the HOA was basing its demands on and whether they had the legal right to tell him what to do with his own property. Mark sat down at his desk, a sense of determination growing inside him as he pulled up his guidelines. He had no intention of backing down without a fight, especially when he knew he had followed the rules as best as he could. As he combed through the HOA documents, his fingers paused over a section he hadn't noticed before: county inspection powers and permissions. The section detailed an interesting loophole he had completely overlooked. Any resident who holds a position of county inspector is exempt from certain HOA rules and restrictions regarding property modifications, including fences, provided the modification is within county safety standards. Mark's mind raced. County inspector? He was the county inspector. He had earned that position several years ago, a job that involved overseeing building codes and zoning laws across the county. As county inspector, Mark had the authority to approve certain modifications and enforce codes, bypassing HOA rules when they didn't align with county laws. He had forgotten the specific details of this privilege in the heat of his recent move, but now it all clicked into place. The HOA couldn't just force him to remove the fence without understanding that his role in the county gave him leverage. Not only was the fence within the county's safety and zoning regulations, but as an inspector, Mark held more power than the HOA could possibly anticipate. He immediately drafted a formal response to the HOA, citing his position as the county inspector and attaching copies of his credentials to make his case clear. The letter was polite but firm. I am aware of the HOA guidelines regarding fences, but as county inspector, I am exempt from these regulations as long as the structure complies with county codes, which this fence does. I ask that you reconsider your demands, or I will be forced to take legal action. With that, Mark felt a surge of confidence. He wasn't just another homeowner caught in the web of an overbearing HOA. He was someone who had the power to challenge them. The HOA wouldn't know what hit them when they realized they had just tried to boss around the wrong person. Feeling empowered, Mark sent off the letter and waited, his mind already swirling with possibilities. He knew the HOA was probably going to contest his claim, but he was prepared for that. If they thought they could bully him into submission, they had another thing coming. Mark wasn't going down without a fight, and this time the HOA was the one who would have to answer to him. A few days passed, and Mark anxiously awaited the HOA's reply. He didn't expect them to back down immediately. After all, this was the same HOA that had sent him the initial demand, confident that their power was unchallenged. He wasn't sure whether they would appreciate his position or challenge it outright. Finally, an envelope arrived with the HOA's letterhead. Mark's pulse quickened as he opened it, scanning the contents. The HOA president, Ms. Carol Henderson, had written back, and as expected, she didn't take kindly to his claim. Her letter was curt and full of legal jargon. She stated that while he might have some county inspection authority, it didn't mean he was exempt from the community's established rules. They considered his fence a violation of HOA guidelines and insisted that it be removed within 30 days or face a fine. They also warned that should he attempt to enforce his county inspector status, they would pursue legal action to have the fence torn down and possibly challenge his position within the county. Mark wasn't surprised by the hostility, but what caught him off guard was the arrogance with which the letter was written. It was clear that they didn't take his position seriously and had no idea just how deep his connection to the county went. They underestimated him, and that would be their downfall. Mark set the letter aside and began formulating his next move. This was no longer just about a fence. It was about setting a precedent. If the HOA thought they could bully him just because they had power over the neighborhood, they needed to be shown that their authority wasn't absolute. He couldn't just let them walk all over him, and he certainly couldn't back down without fighting for his rights. That night, Mark spent hours in his home office, drafting an even stronger response. This time, he not only reaffirmed his position as the county inspector, but he also reminded them of the legal consequences of overstepping their boundaries. He included a copy of his job description, his badge, and his full legal rights as a county inspector. Mark made it crystal clear that he had every right to maintain the fence, as it had been built in full compliance with county zoning laws, and the HOA had no jurisdiction to demand its removal. He sent the letter off the next morning, making sure to keep a copy for himself. This wasn't just a battle over a fence anymore. It was a showdown between the power of the HOA and his own legal rights. If they wanted to fight, Mark was ready to make sure they learned a hard lesson about who was really in charge here. As the days went by, Mark couldn't help but feel a bit of satisfaction. He wasn't just sitting idly by, he was taking control of his situation, and he wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. He knew the HOA would come back swinging, but he was more than prepared to face whatever they threw his way. This was a fight he wasn't going to lose. Just as Mark had expected, they didn't take his letter lying down. Less than a week later, another letter arrived. This time, however, it wasn't a polite demand. It was an outright threat. The letter from Ms. Carol Henderson was filled with veiled threats and legal language meant to intimidate. The letter asserted that despite Mark's position as county inspector, the HOA had the ultimate authority within the neighborhood. They claimed that his fence was still in violation of the HOA guidelines and that he was legally obligated to comply with their rules, or else he would face severe penalties, including hefty fines. They also mentioned the possibility of legal action and stated that they were consulting their attorneys to pursue enforcement of their demand. At first, Mark felt his blood pressure rise. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. They were pushing him into a corner, assuming that he would back down. The language in the letter was filled with threats of lawsuits and enforcement actions, but none of it mattered to Mark. He knew the HOA had no legal ground to stand on. The more he read through the letter, the more he realized how badly they had miscalculated. They were essentially challenging his authority as the county inspector. They were implying that they could override zoning laws, county regulations, and his own legal rights just because they held sway within the neighborhood. They were making it personal, and that was something Mark wouldn't let slide. After a few moments of collecting his thoughts, Mark picked up the phone and called the county's legal department. He explained the situation and asked for advice. He also wanted to ensure that his rights were being fully upheld in this situation. The attorney he spoke with, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel, confirmed what Mark already knew. The HOA had no jurisdiction to overrule county laws, especially in cases of zoning and property maintenance. Rachel also suggested that Mark prepare for a more formal confrontation, one that could potentially involve court proceedings if the HOA continued to push him. With her legal backing and a clear understanding of the situation, Mark knew it was time to escalate things. He began drafting a response, this time with an even stronger tone. He made sure to reference county laws, specific regulations regarding property rights, and the explicit limitations of HOA authority. He even made sure to include the phone number of the county's zoning office, inviting Ms. Henderson and her board members to contact them directly to clarify the legality of the situation. Mark also made it clear that any further attempts to harass him would not be taken lightly. If the HOA pursued legal action, he would gladly meet them in court, and he was more than confident that he would win. With the letter ready to go, Mark stood up from his desk and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about a fence. It was about making sure the HOA understood their place, and more importantly, making sure they knew that they couldn't push him around. They had underestimated him, and now they were about to face the consequences. He dropped the letter in the mail, knowing that it would be the beginning of the end of this battle. It was time to put his foot down and show the HOA who was really in charge of this neighborhood. The next few days were tense. Mark continued with his daily routine, checking on properties, reviewing zoning regulations, and keeping a careful eye on any follow-up from the HOA. He knew they wouldn't just let his legal response slide, but he wasn't prepared for the kind of pushback that came next. It was on a Thursday afternoon when Mark received an unexpected knock on his door. Standing there with their arms crossed and stern expressions on their faces were three members of the HOA board, including Ms. Henderson herself, the president. They had come to have a conversation, or so they said. Mark opened a door, maintaining a calm and measured demeanor. "Can I help you?" he asked, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, just as they had done to him a few minutes ago. Ms. Henderson wasted no time. "Mr. Jacobs, we've come here in person to resolve this issue," she said in a condescending tone, as if she was the one in control. "We've received your letter, and frankly, we find it disrespectful and unnecessary. The fence you've put up violates the HOA's established guidelines, and we are simply asking you to follow the rules." Mark didn't flinch. He knew what they were trying to do. They were used to intimidating residents into submission, using threats and power plays to get their way. But Mark wasn't going to be intimidated. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Mark responded calmly. "My fence does not violate any laws. In fact, it's well within my legal rights to put it up as I have. And as I pointed out in my letter, you have no jurisdiction over me in this matter." The HOA members exchanged awkward glances, realizing they were losing their grip on the situation. Ms. Henderson's face turned red with frustration, but she tried to maintain control. "You're playing with fire here, Mr. Jacobs. If you refuse to comply, we'll escalate this to the next level. We won't just stop at fines, we'll take legal action. And I assure you, we have the full support of the neighborhood behind us." Mark raised an eyebrow at her comment. "Is that so?" He paused, allowing a small smile to tug at the corners of his lips. "Because if I recall correctly, the majority of this neighborhood doesn't even support the HOA's decision-making." In fact, I've had several people approach me about how much they disagree with your leadership. Perhaps you should focus on resolving those issues before coming to me." The look on Ms. Henderson's face was priceless. She had clearly expected Mark to back down, but instead, she was caught in a web of her own making. Mark had played his hand perfectly, subtly reminding her that the community was not exactly on her side. "I'm not going to get into a debate with you, Mr. Jacobs," she snapped, visibly rattled. "But you can't keep defying us. You'll regret it." Mark shook his head. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm the county inspector. I know what the law says, and I know you can't touch my property. You're playing a dangerous game by trying to enforce rules that don't even apply. If you want to keep pushing this, I suggest you consult with your legal team. Because if you continue to harass me, I'll make sure this issue goes public, and we both know that's not something you want." Ms. Henderson looked like she had just been slapped. The other two members of the board stood silently, avoiding eye contact, their power crumbling in front of them. It was clear that they were out of their depth now. Mark didn't give them a chance to recover. "So here's what's going to happen. You'll take your little team and go back to your office, and we'll consider this matter closed. If you choose to continue pursuing this, I'll make sure the entire county knows exactly how you've been overstepping your bounds." Without waiting for a response, Mark stepped back and closed the door, effectively ending the conversation. He knew the HOA had been caught off guard, and he had no intention of letting them regain control. That evening, as he reflected on the interaction, Mark felt a sense of satisfaction. He had stood his ground, made his point, and sent a clear message to the HOA. They could no longer bully him into submission. The tables had turned, and it was now their turn to back off. After the confrontation at Mark's house, the HOA seemed rattled, but they weren't ready to let go just yet. Despite Mark's calm assertion of his rights, they thought they could still pull some strings behind the scenes. Over the next few days, the board members began to work on Plan B, rallying support from other residents in the neighborhood who might be on their side. Ms. Henderson, eager to save face, initiated a meeting with some of the longtime residents who were known to favor the HOA's control. She believed that if she could gather a group of like-minded people, they could pressure Mark into submission. With her persuasive skills, she planned to cast Mark as a troublemaker who was defying the community's values. The HOA board organized a neighborhood meeting and distributed flyers calling for residents to come together and discuss the issue with the fence, positioning it as a matter of principle. "We need to maintain the standards of our community, and that fence is simply too much," the flyer boldly declared. As the evening of the meeting approached, Mark didn't panic. He already knew what was coming, and he was prepared. He had heard whispers around the neighborhood about how the HOA had been manipulating the rules to their advantage, and he knew many people were fed up with their constant interference. In fact, a number of residents had reached out to him after his public stand, offering their support. Mark decided to attend the meeting as well. Armed with his knowledge of the law and the support of his neighbors, he knew he could turn the tables on the HOA. When Mark entered the meeting, he was met with a tense atmosphere. Some of the residents were quietly murmuring among themselves, while others exchanged wary glances. The HOA members were seated at the front, with Ms. Henderson leading the charge. She looked a little more desperate now, and it didn't take long for Mark to sense that they were losing their grip. Ms. Henderson immediately tried to take control of the room. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her tone polite but with an underlying edge of authority. "As most of you are aware, Mr. Jacobs has put up an illegal fence on his property. It's an eyesore and a violation of our community's aesthetic standards. We need to address this issue for the good of everyone." Mark, who had been quietly observing the room, stood up. "Actually, I think it's time we set the record straight," he said, his voice calm but cutting through the tension. "I've seen the flyers you handed out, and I think it's important we have a real discussion here." He continued, walking toward the front of the room and speaking to the group of residents. "I've lived here for years, just like many of you. And while I respect our community, I've also seen how the HOA operates, how it constantly oversteps its bounds. We all know that the HOA's main interest is in maintaining control. But what the board doesn't want you to know is that they are the ones breaking the rules." The room went silent as Mark's words sunk in. Several residents exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in agreement. Ms. Henderson's face flushed red, her tight grip on the meeting quickly slipping away. "I've had conversations with a lot of you, and I know there's a growing frustration with the way the HOA tries to push its agenda," Mark continued. This fence I built isn't illegal, and I'm well within my rights to put it up. But I also know that many of you are tired of being told how to live on your own properties. And if the HOA continues to act like they own this neighborhood, we're going to have a much bigger problem on our hands." A few residents, emboldened by Mark's words, began to nod in agreement. One woman raised her hand. "Mark's right. We've been paying HOA fees for years, but what have we gotten in return? All these unnecessary rules, and for what?" Another man spoke up. "I've had enough of these meetings where they act like we don't have a say. It's time to take a stand." The more Mark spoke, the more the tide seemed to turn. The HOA board looked visibly uncomfortable as they realized their attempt to rally support had backfired. Instead of swaying the crowd, they had stirred up a sense of rebellion. Residents who had once been quiet were now speaking out, questioning the authority of the HOA. Ms. Henderson, now visibly sweating, tried to regain control. "This is not the place to discuss personal grievances," she said, trying to shut the meeting down. "We need to focus on the issue at hand." But it was too late. The room had turned, and it was clear that the residents were no longer willing to be intimidated. Mark had succeeded in doing what the HOA had feared most. He had united the neighborhood. With the crowd now on his side, Mark made his final point. "The HOA was supposed to represent us, not control us. If you want to keep pushing this, be prepared for the consequences. But I suggest we all focus on making this neighborhood a place where we can all live freely, without constant interference." With that, Mark sat back down, the conversation shifting in his favor. The HOA's plan had backfired spectacularly, and their attempts to control the neighborhood were crumbling. Mark had turned their own tactics against them, and now he was in control. Realizing that they had lost the support of the community, the HOA wasn't about to give up easily. They had always prided themselves on enforcing their rules, no matter what, and now they were backed into a corner. Their first attempt to rally support from the residents had failed, so they decided to take a more aggressive approach. They would fight Mark legally, using their influence and resources to intimidate him into submission. A few days after the meeting, Mark received a letter in the mail. The HOA had hired a high-powered lawyer, and they were coming after him with everything they had. The letter was filled with legal jargon, threats of fines, and the potential for a lawsuit if Mark didn't comply and remove the fence immediately. It was clear that the HOA had intended to make an example of him. If they couldn't win by the people's support, they would try to use fear and legal pressure to force him into compliance. But Mark wasn't one to back down easily. As the county inspector, he had a wealth of legal knowledge at his disposal, and he knew exactly how to respond. He quickly read through the letter, finding several inconsistencies and misrepresentations in their claims. The HOA had clearly overstepped their bounds, and Mark knew they were bluffing. Instead of panicking, Mark calmly took the letter to his lawyer, who specialized in property law. Together, they analyzed every detail. It became clear that the HOA had no legal ground to stand on. Their demands were based on outdated and selectively applied rules, and they were attempting to impose those rules on Mark unfairly. His lawyer quickly drafted a response, pointing out the HOA's overreach and making it clear that Mark would not be intimidated into removing the fence. "I know the law, and they don't," Mark said with determination. "They've made a huge mistake by trying to use legal threats to control me. Now, it's time to turn the tables." The response letter was sent out, and within a few days, Mark's lawyer received a call from the HOA's attorney. The tone had shifted drastically. The once confident lawyer from the HOA now sounded defensive, almost apologetic. They had realized that they were not dealing with someone they could push around easily. Mark wasn't just a regular homeowner, he was someone who understood the law and was willing to stand up for his rights. The HOA's lawyer tried to salvage the situation by suggesting a compromise. "Perhaps we can come to an agreement," he said, "but you'll need to remove the fence and pay a fine to settle the matter." Mark wasn't buying it. "No deal. Your client is the one in the wrong here, and I'm not going to be bullied into backing down. If they want to take this further, they're welcome to. But I'm not removing my fence, and I won't be paying any fines." The HOA's lawyer, realizing they were at a dead end, backed off, suggesting that they might drop the case altogether if Mark complied. But by now, Mark was resolute. He knew the HOA had no case, and he wasn't about to give them an inch. Meanwhile, the HOA's reputation continued to suffer. Word spread throughout the neighborhood about the HOA's attempted intimidation and their inability to legally justify their demands. More and more residents began to question the HOA's authority and the fairness of their tactics. Mark's steadfast refusal to back down had not only defended his fence, but it also exposed the HOA for what it truly was, a group of power-hungry individuals who cared more about control than the welfare of the community. Mark's strategy of standing firm, being well-informed, and refusing to be intimidated had turned the situation in his favor. And while the HOA might have had legal resources at their disposal, Mark had something far more powerful on his side: the support of his neighbors and an unwavering commitment to his property rights. The HOA had no choice but to retreat, defeated not by the law, but by the very community they thought they could control. After their failed legal threat, the HOA was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered credibility. They knew that their aggressive tactics had backfired, and that their once unquestioned authority had been seriously undermined. The HOA's leadership, especially the board members who had spearheaded the fence removal initiative, were left scrambling to figure out how to recover from the damage they'd caused. In an attempt to salvage their reputation and avoid further confrontation, the HOA issued an official statement to the residents. The statement was carefully worded to imply that they had been acting in the best interest of the community and that they would reevaluate their policies to avoid future misunderstandings. They tried to downplay the situation, casting it as a simple miscommunication rather than a full-blown power struggle. But it was clear to everyone that the HOA was more concerned with saving face than actually addressing the real issues at hand. Mark, however, wasn't impressed by the HOA's feeble attempt at damage control. He knew that their statement was nothing more than a public relations maneuver to shift blame away from their poor decision-making. While the HOA was busy issuing apologies, Mark continued to stand his ground, knowing that their ability to intimidate him had already been shattered. The community, which had once been so intimidated by the HOA's demands, now viewed Mark as a symbol of resistance against unjust authority. Rather than feeling relieved by the HOA's backpedaling, Mark realized that this situation could serve as a teaching moment for his neighbors. He knew that many of them, especially the older residents, had felt powerless against the HOA's rules for years. But now, with the HOA's credibility in question, they were starting to see that it was possible to challenge the status quo and win. Mark organized a community meeting, inviting everyone to discuss the HOA's actions and what could be done to prevent future conflicts. The meeting quickly turned into a celebration of community unity and empowerment. Mark shared his story, detailing how the HOA had tried to control his property and how he had fought back, using knowledge of the law, staying firm in his resolve, and refusing to be intimidated. The neighbors, many of whom had been silent and compliant with the HOA's demands in the past, began to speak up. They shared their own frustrations with the HOA's overreach and the constant fear of fines or penalties for minor infractions. The meeting was filled with conversations about how the HOA had created an environment of fear and control, and how they could all work together to ensure that the HOA's power wasn't abused any longer. Mark's victory had inspired others to stand up for their rights. And the HOA, which had once thought they were untouchable, now found themselves facing a wave of resistance from the very community they had tried to control. The board members, who had once seemed so powerful, were now realizing that their days of dictating the terms of life in the neighborhood were numbered. But Mark wasn't finished. He knew that the HOA's ability to manipulate and intimidate would not disappear overnight. He continued to document every interaction with the HOA, carefully collecting evidence of their overreach, knowing that he might need it in the future. He also worked with his neighbors to propose changes to the HOA's bylaws, suggesting more transparency, accountability, and checks on their power. What had started as a personal battle over a simple fence had evolved into a much larger struggle for the rights of the entire neighborhood. And Mark, with the help of his neighbors, was ready to ensure that the HOA would never again act as if they had the power to dictate every aspect of life in the community. The battle for control of the neighborhood wasn't just about property lines, it was about the fundamental rights of the people who lived there. As for the HOA, their attempts to restore their authority were futile. They had underestimated the power of one person standing up for what was right, and in doing so, they had ignited a movement that would forever change the way the community viewed their so-called rules. The HOA might have tried to intimidate Mark, but in the end, it was their own power that had crumbled, leaving Mark and the community victorious. Despite the mounting pressure from the community, the HOA was not going down without one final attempt to reassert its authority. The board members, still reeling from their defeat, realized that they couldn't simply let Mark's victory go unchallenged. They needed to make a statement, a reminder to the entire neighborhood that they were still in control. They called an emergency meeting, one that was hastily arranged and closed to the public, trying to project an air of seriousness and urgency. The meeting was set to discuss emergency amendments to the neighborhood's governing documents. These changes, according to the HOA, would reinforce the bylaws and bring order back to the community, though Mark and many of his neighbors saw it for what it truly was, a last-ditch power grab to circumvent the growing opposition. Word of the meeting spread quickly, and many of the community members who had supported Mark, both openly and behind the scenes, were outraged. They understood that this meeting wasn't about improving the neighborhood. It was about the HOA's desperate attempt to retain control. Mark knew he had to take action quickly. He couldn't afford to let the HOA regain its footing and undo all the progress they'd made. Determined not to let the HOA set the agenda, Mark decided to attend the meeting. This time, however, he wouldn't be there alone. He organized a group of concerned neighbors, many of whom had never before stood up to the HOA, to attend the meeting in solidarity. They had one goal: to ensure the HOA couldn't make any changes without public scrutiny and input. When Mark and his group arrived at the HOA's office, they were met with cold stares from the board members, who had clearly not expected such a show of force. The atmosphere was tense, and the board members wasted no time trying to intimidate the group by enforcing rules about who could speak and when. But Mark, having already proven himself unafraid of the HOA's attempts to bully him, stood firm. He demanded transparency and insisted that the meeting be open to the public, despite the HOA's objections. The board initially refused, claiming that the nature of the meeting was too delicate to allow public participation. But the residents weren't having it. One by one, Mark's neighbors stood up to demand that their voices be heard. It wasn't long before the HOA realized they couldn't silence an entire community. Seeing that their meeting was about to descend into chaos, the HOA was forced to relent. They grudgingly agreed to allow a public forum and invited Mark to speak. He took the opportunity to address the board and the crowd of residents, reminding them of the power they held as a community. He emphasized that the HOA was supposed to serve them, not the other way around, and that their tactics of intimidation and secrecy had no place in a neighborhood built on trust and mutual respect. The HOA's plan to make emergency amendments to the bylaws was quickly derailed. The public forum allowed for open discussion, and several residents spoke out about their own experiences with the HOA's overreach. The board members could only sit in silence, knowing that they had lost the support of the people they were supposed to serve. As the meeting came to a close, the HOA was forced to announce that they would be withdrawing the proposed amendments. They also promised to review their policies in a more transparent and inclusive manner, though Mark and his neighbors knew this was more about saving face than genuine change. While Mark's victory in this meeting didn't guarantee that the HOA's behavior would change overnight, it was another clear sign that the community was no longer going to tolerate being pushed around. The HOA had underestimated the strength of the people they had tried to control, and they were paying the price for it. For Mark, this victory was about more than just protecting his property. It was about ensuring that future generations wouldn't have to live under the thumb of a board that saw them as nothing more than subjects to be ruled. It was about setting a precedent that the HOA was not above the law or the will of the people. And as he walked out of that meeting, he felt a deep sense of pride, not only in his own actions, but in the collective power of his neighbors to stand up for what was right. The HOA may have thought they could regain control through force and secrecy, but Mark and the rest of the community had shown them that their power was fleeting. The residents, now more united than ever, knew they were ready to hold the HOA accountable and ensure that their rights were never again trampled on. After the debacle at the emergency meeting, the HOA faced a stark realization. They no longer held the unchallenged power they once did. For years, they had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, issuing fines, enforcing arbitrary rules, and evicting residents without question. But after Mark's victory, the board was forced to confront the reality that the people were no longer afraid of them. They had underestimated the resolve of the community and the power of one determined individual. The HOA's efforts to regain control of the situation were not only futile, but they were also becoming increasingly desperate. Mark knew that, despite their public retreat, the HOA would continue to look for ways to assert dominance. They wouldn't just give up. After all, this wasn't about the fence anymore. It was about control, power, and maintaining their perceived authority. A few weeks after the meeting, Mark started receiving letters from the HOA again. They were trying to pull every trick in the book. New threats, vague threats about fines, and demands that were laced with passive-aggressive language. But Mark wasn't intimidated. He had a plan. He had already enlisted the help of several neighbors who were all too willing to fight back, and they were ready for the next round. The community's resolve grew stronger with every attempt the HOA made to impose its will. Mark organized a town hall meeting for residents to discuss their concerns, and the turnout was overwhelming. The more people who came forward to share their stories of mistreatment by the HOA, the more it became clear that the HOA's reign of terror was coming to an end. Every time they tried to punish someone or enforce an unreasonable rule, it only fueled the fire of resistance within the community. In fact, word about the HOA's increasingly unprofessional and undemocratic behavior spread far beyond Mark's neighborhood. People from nearby areas began reaching out to offer their support. The HOA's reputation was tarnished by the exposure of their tactics, and they found themselves facing a growing backlash. Neighbors from other communities started questioning their own HOA's actions and policies, wondering if they too were being unfairly targeted. Realizing that they had become a laughingstock in the eyes of the public, the HOA board members decided to take a more subtle approach. They dropped the overtly aggressive tactics and began sending out softer letters, offering compromises and seeking a peaceful resolution. But it was clear to Mark and the rest of the community that the HOA had been completely weakened. They weren't looking for real compromise. They were simply trying to salvage their failing power. Mark and his neighbors, now more united than ever, continued to hold the HOA accountable. They organized a petition to call for new elections on the board, demanding that the individuals who had caused so much chaos be replaced with more reasonable leaders. It wasn't just about one person anymore. It was about ensuring that the HOA could never again operate with such unchecked power. The community stood together, their solidarity stronger than ever before. After months of back-and-forth struggles, legal letters, and mounting pressure, the HOA's leadership finally began to crumble. The constant barrage of public criticism, lawsuits, and the sheer willpower of Mark and his neighbors had taken its toll. The once feared HOA board was now facing the consequences of their actions. The residents were no longer willing to back down, and they had successfully rallied the community in a way the HOA could not have imagined. In a final embarrassing move, the HOA called a public meeting to address the growing concerns about their leadership. But this time, there was no one left to defend them. The community had made their voices heard, and it was clear that they were not going to let the HOA continue to rule them. During this public meeting, Mark and the other residents presented their demands: new leadership, a complete review of the neighborhood's rules, and the removal of any board member who had been involved in the previous unethical actions. The meeting became an overwhelming show of force. One by one, residents stepped up to speak, recounting how they had been mistreated, how the HOA's arbitrary rules had negatively impacted their lives, and how they had been silenced for far too long. The board members, once so confident in their position, could no longer deny the widespread discontent. The members of the HOA board were forced to resign, and the remaining board members were given an ultimatum: resign or face legal action. Within weeks, the HOA was disbanded. Mark and his neighbors had taken back their neighborhood, reclaiming the power that rightfully belonged to them. They elected new, fair-minded individuals to lead the community, and they worked together to overhaul the bylaws, ensuring that every voice in the neighborhood would be heard. The battle was won, not just for Mark, but for every resident who had endured the HOA's oppression. They had proven that when people stand together, they can defeat even the most entrenched powers. Mark's victory became a symbol of resilience, unity, and the power of community. As Mark looked around his neighborhood, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. It wasn't just about the fence or the HOA anymore. It was about a community that had come together and stood up for what was right. The HOA had tried to break them, but in the end, it was the residents who had broken free. And the message was clear: never underestimate the strength of a united community.